In just a few years, our system will be at its end. Professor Hans-Werner Sinn talks about tipping points that are being reached and that the euro is at massive risk. And Germany is a key player here because although Germany cannot directly trigger the collapse, Germany can indirectly cause the system to really hit the wall. These are absolutely shocking arguments being put on the table. And Hans-Werner doesn't mince his words here, but he says what many people already know intuitively and what many people already suspect or people who are then labeled as conspiracy theorists. He simply says, folks, we need to pay very close attention to what's going on right now. Our prosperity is at stake here. The currency is at stake. And if the currency crashes, it will drag the economy down with it. That means a loss of prosperity, but there is a way out. And that's called Bitcoin. First, let's take a look at the highly explosive statements from Hans-Werner Sinn that even shocked me. We can already see it here in the title. In just a few years, our system will be at its end. I'll also drop the link to the full interview down below. So, this is absolutely explosive, but just give it a listen.
As a final question, Professor Sinn, the topic of debt, also the topic of the debt break. Germany has to somehow manage the balancing act. The social system is continuing to expand more and more, but we also need to somehow stimulate our economy. What do you think could be coming for a potential new government? On the topic of debt, how should we deal with the debt break and the issue of debt in the coming years?
Your question implicitly suggests that debt stimulates the economy. So I can only warn against that idea. That is indeed the case. Demand is being created. That would be useful in a time, Keynesian underemployment, so where there is spare capacity, but we have no spare capacity. We have too little energy and not enough people who can work. There's a shortage of skilled workers. So there's absolutely no way we could talk about needing a demand-stimulating policy through debt right now. In some sense, that just creates even more inflation, and I see a resurgence. Flames of inflation from the debt orgies in America and Europe that are looming here. By the way, here comes.
So that's really important to keep in mind. That's also what all the Marcel Frachers, all the economic ministers are telling you. And they keep saying that wealth can be created here through printing money. But that's absolutely not the case. And he's even talking about an inflation risk, how inflation could come back massively here. If a ton more money is printed here, that would lead to that the dollar is inflating, that the euro is inflating, but that also means that liquidity is increasing, which will drive up Bitcoin. That means there are also potential signs here. Good signs for Bitcoin, but this is obviously catastrophic for the euro and the dollar, what's happening here.
By the way, debt is extremely dangerous because creditworthiness is decreasing. Now we have a system in Europe where the central bank actively buying up the bonds of the debtor states, and that keeps the spreads reduced to Germany. And they've broken the normal mechanism where the borrower pays higher interest rates and therefore stops massively going into debt on their own. But everything depends on Germany's creditworthiness. France seems to be tipping over in this regard as well after the Mediterranean countries have already tipped. Then they say, we saved Greece, Greece is on the rise again. But we basically gifted Greece an entire GDP through all the debt moratoriums that were put in place. In 2012, it happened twice with both private and public hands, and then again in 2015. That was a social product that was given to the Greeks. We can do that with Greece, a small country, but not with France and not with Italy. This path just won't work. It's not repeatable. And if Germany now gives up the same power as the French and Italians and also debt discipline, then the entire European system will slide down the hill. Because everything right now hinges on the German anchor. Germany's willingness to pay for the debts of other countries through all the distribution mechanisms, in particular the euro system. That's the fundamental prerequisite for the others to be able to do that. If we do it now, then that is a huge danger for the existence of the eurozone.
So, this is just absolutely mind-blowing. He says the existence of the euro area depends directly on Germany. And Germany could now be the key player that either drives the whole thing into a wall or keeps it going. And this has so much explosive potential because no politician will tell you this, and no ECB will either. No economic minister or anyone like that will tell you this. And I know that this is always a very, very controversial topic with the debt break. And I understand that, in theory, it makes no sense for us to stick to the debt break when all the other countries are getting into massive debt. A debt break makes sense if all countries stick to it, but if you stick to it while all the other countries don't, then you end up at a competitive disadvantage compared to those countries. And now we basically have the problem where on one side you have people like Robert Habeck saying, hey, let's bypass the debt break. We need to go all out. But Hans-Werner Sinn is giving a serious warning here. He says, if we do this, then we're leading the euro system directly into ruin. And he explains it very, very simply. You really have to understand this a bit deeper because he's talking about a country's creditworthiness. That means the more a country goes into debt, the more its creditworthiness suffers. Of course, I prefer to do business with a country that has no debt. The chances of me coming out of this situation in good shape are higher. It's like when I'm making deals with a country where the debt to GDP ratio is like 500%. No one would do that. And now he's talking about a fraud, and officially it's not even labeled as fraud, but in reality what's happening here is really fraud because we're looking at different interest rate spreads. So normally, if a country has bad creditworthiness, interest rates just go up. That's because, for example, nobody wants to buy their bonds or nobody wants to do business with that country, so the interest rates go up. That means the cost of money just goes up. You can't just go into debt that easily. But what's happening here in the Eurozone is that the spreads are being minimized. So it's being done now from the central bank side, for example, I think. It's not happening right now, but it definitely took place. I'm not sure, maybe Hans-Werner is here too. Maybe he's talking about the past. I'm not sure if it's happening right now, but I really don't think so. But it has definitely happened before that the spreads are minimized, for example, when the Fed does QE, meaning they basically print money. And now she's buying from certain countries that might not have such high creditworthiness. She's mainly buying government bonds from these countries to push the interest rates down. If there is more demand for government bonds, then interest rates go down. Then the market gets the impression that, oh, this is a stable country, there is high demand, lots of people are buying government bonds, then I have to be here too. And for countries that already have good credit, we sometimes sell government bonds and then swap that money into countries that don't have such good credit, or into countries that just don't have a strong standing. So, for example, German government bond putters then sell the money into Italian government bonds. When we do QE, most of the money doesn't flow into Germany. Instead, it mostly goes to Greece, Italy, or any states that aren't doing so well. In the past, it was always the case that when they did QE, it was just distributed according to a key. That means it would be evaluated based on the gross domestic product. And depending on how high the gross domestic product is, the corresponding shares of government bonds would be bought. But for now, that's been put on hold. And that is what Hans-Werner Sinn is talking about here, that through the spread fraud here, you're being given a false picture of the economy. That means you might think, for example, wow, it's not that bad here. It looks like the government bonds from Greece or Italy are really in demand. But no, these are just internal shifts where money is being moved around internally, making it look like Italian government bonds are more attractive than they actually are. And then he also talks about bailouts. And now it's getting really relevant because we already had the bailouts in Greece where, for example, Germany had to co-sign or pay up so that Greece basically goes bankrupt. And in a small state, he says you can definitely do that here. But when it comes to a significant state, Germany can't just bail out France or something like that. It would completely break the whole euro system. And that's basically the blind man or the broken man or the sick man, I don't know how to put it, here in Europe. France is definitely the nation that is having problems with debt. And Hans-Werner Sinn is making the argument that if not only France gets into trouble, but if Germany also lifts the debt brake and finds itself in a similar situation, then it means that the euro system is even more at risk. Because then it's not just France facing collapse. Germany would be too. You have to say Germany's debt ratio is relatively good compared to others. That means they are not really good, but you could say that Germany is the one-eyed man among the blind, which means it is relatively better than other countries. And yes, it must also be said that Germany is the big loser of the entire euro system, because the other countries are basically living at Germany's expense. That means Germany is basically the cash cow that's being massively milked. But Hans-Werner Sinn still says that if we don't let ourselves be milk dry, then the whole euro will go bankrupt, the whole system will go bust. And Germany might not be the direct trigger, but it could be the indirect one, because such a debt excess could be triggered by Germany taking on even more debt, which would then encourage other nations to do the same, causing the whole economic system to go even further off the rails. And that will indirectly trigger the crisis. And then some state is going to directly trigger the crisis, where France goes bankrupt or something else goes under. And then maybe you can't bail it out anymore. The whole system would be completely broken. There are also people who say, hey, we need to get out of the euro. But the problem is, if you want to get out of the euro now, it's actually already too late. You probably should have gotten out a few years ago. It would have been easier back then. Now it's really difficult to exit. That means the exit gets easier the sooner you make it in a Ponzi scheme. The later you wait, the harder it is to reverse or turn things around. I mean, fixing this is already very, very hopeless. In principle it might work, but it is simply unrealistic because so much would have to change in the political system, so much would have to change in the central bank. It's almost unimaginable to reform the system here. But even an exit is very, very difficult or nearly impossible. And all that's left in the end is that Germany is getting milked dry. According to Hans-Werner Sinn, Germany has to let itself be milked. Because if Germany keeps going and really goes all out here, and even more, living way beyond their means. So they're already living beyond their means, but if they just keep going all out, racking up more debt, lifting the debt brake, all that stuff, it's just going to lead to the system crashing even faster. And that's basically it. Highly explosive statements that you really need to think about. I mean, you can also look at it positively. It would be good for Bitcoin. So the faster fiat money explodes, the faster this whole shit show implodes. And of course, that means a huge boost in adoption for Bitcoin, because a lot of people will start thinking, okay, if the money system collapses, what do I do with my money? Where do I save my money? Where can I go? And here, Bitcoin is a safe anchor. I don't think Hans-Werner Sinn has really considered Bitcoin yet. He had a really, really good analysis, but he didn't have any real solutions yet. I sometimes find that a shame. When you're here, he makes analyses, but sometimes the solutions are missing. I mean, it's a controversial topic. I also know a lot of Bitcoin supporters who advocate for a debt brake. I don't want to take a pro or con stance here. Let's just say, I'm not saying I'm for or against the debt brake. The system is designed to fail anyway. And we're basically discussing here, okay, how can we possibly keep the system going for another 5 years? How can we possibly keep the system going for another 10 years? Some say, okay, with a debt brake, the system might last another 3 or 4 years. Others say that without a debt brake, we're heading straight for the wall even faster. Then there are other people who have the opposite argument. You always have to weigh everything against each other here. On one hand, we have the currency. We can basically weaken the currency to strengthen the economy. That might be true in the short term. In the long run, everything is going to fall apart. On the other hand, we could, for example, strengthen the currency again, but that would weaken the economy. So that means we have short-term problems, but in the long run, we might be better off. That means that these are very, very complicated questions that cannot really be answered because we are simply in a system in which here somehow has created a problem that can't be solved anymore. That's why it's really, really hard to find answers here. With Bitcoin, of course, it is much, much easier. And if you want to buy Bitcoin, I'll give you a link below. 21 Bitcoin, how you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin. Here, you can get up to 20% off the fees when buying Bitcoin with the code limit orders, bar plans, one-time orders. There are so many things you can do here. Check out auto wallet transfers for sure. Save 20% on the fees when buying Bitcoin. Guys, let me know what you think about the wild theories. Peace out.